This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with Pepita Ferrari, director of Capturing Reality, the Art of Documentary. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Pepita Ferrari is the director of a new documentary about the documentary called Capturing Reality, the Art of Documentary, which is now available in a 2-disc DVD edition. Pepita, welcome to the program.
Hi, Colin. It's great to be here.
What I want to know first is, when you started on this project, how much did you have to look to as far as examples, as far as precedents of documentary work about the documentary?
Actually, it was a very short search because there essentially really wasn't very much out there. There had been a few things done about early documentary work, and that was not the goal of this project. It was really to give an overview of where documentary is at right now.
And the evolution of this idea, now there's so much talk in the film from documentarians, and this is true of, I suppose, fiction filmmakers as well. They all say, my idea changed so much since I began the project. Did this happen to you as well? Was this something else to begin with?
Well, no. I think we really did follow through from beginning to end on what the original goal had been. The only thing that really did change was the size of the undertaking, which grew exponentially, yeah.
They do have a way of doing that. Now, this was originally intended to be how big then?
Actually, when we started out, we were thinking, 15, 20. I had kind of looked at other sort of anthology-type documentaries about editing, for example, or visions of light, about cinematography.
Oh, yes.
So I was kind of using those as my guideline about how many people would make sense before it would start getting too chaotic. And at first it was like, 20 seems about right, And actually it ended up being double that.
And you have some of my very favorite documentarians in the film, which of course I want to talk about each of them, but were there any documentarians you said to yourself, I absolutely must have these people or else this project isn't going to be what I want it to be?
Of course there were some. For me, what was really important was to try and cover quite a broad spectrum of work, because to me one of the most amazing and wonderful things about documentary is the whole kind of wide range of possibilities that it proposes to a filmmaker. And I love that about it. That's why I do it, and I wanted to convey that. So for me, it was really, really important that I had people like Werner Herzog, who is completely at the other end of the spectrum.
Yes.
And, people like Errol Morris, of course, who have done, such incredibly sort of breakthrough kinds of work, That would be two examples that come to mind, but I could go into every one of them and give you a reason why it was really important that they were in the film, yeah.
Indeed, Morris and Herzog were two of my favorites to see there, because I've seen all their films and I very much enjoy them. But I want to get an idea of what is your experience now purely as a viewer, purely as an enthusiast of the documentary. How far back does it go? Is this a lifetime passion for you, documentaries?
It's interesting. I actually started out in animation. I was working in animation for 12 years. And as I was working in animation, earning my living as, an artist in animation, I also was painting on the side and was getting more and more kind of impassioned by painting. And the way I got started in documentary was actually because of one particular painting that just stopped me in my tracks. And there I was thinking, somebody should make a film about that artist, And then, I started thinking, Pepita, you say that quite a lot, and maybe it's actually you who should make the film. So that's how I got started in documentary, and that was, 17 years ago.
And the way you started, the way you transitioned from enthusiast to actual maker of documentaries, is this something you did by simply plunging in? It seems like from the filmmakers you talk to in capturing reality, there is a lot of plunging in to be done when you're going to go into a field like documentary.
That was absolutely my case. Yes. I just plunged right in. I've always been sort of a self-taught person because I find it just a bit too far removed when I go and study something and then try and apply what I've learned in the institution. I'm somebody who really loves learning on the spot. So, of course, documentary is perfect for somebody like me because you're constantly learning.
And when you talk to, specifically when you talk to this whole gallery of documentary filmmakers you have in capturing reality, now, could you begin sort of comparing notes with them, maybe not literally, but sort of in your mind when you just were talking about their roots? Could you see the same experience, your own experience, reflected in what they told you about theirs?
It's a very particular world that documentarians live in, and it's something that when you talk to your fellow documentarians, there's just an immediate understanding. No matter what kind of documentary work that each of us are doing, we all immediately connect to that whole sort of world of the unknown, and the unknown being, of course, something that is reflected in every stage of our work, because so often we start out on a path that is completely unknown when we're thinking about making a documentary, and then there's the complete unknown of how we're going to ever fund it, that kind of thing, and then when in production, it's so I suppose there's that sort of tenuous nature of what we do that we are so connected by, and it was just amazing to be able to share the experiences that everyone was able to bring to the table when I was asking them about their work. I don't know. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but there's kind of this immediate connection amongst. It's almost like a brotherhood or sisterhood, I guess.
It's a connection maybe of perspective, where these people have seen the world the same way you have tried to see it.
Yeah, and there's something about the human connection that you go for when you're doing documentary, and it's a very special way of trying to understand human nature and who we are, and trying to bring that out so that we understand each other better.
When you talk about the world of documentary filmmakers, I want to know how connected a world this is. I mean, when you started talking to one filmmaker, did they know all the rest, or is it more of a world in the sense that it's a sensibility you all share rather than an actual socially connected world of documentary filmmakers?
Well, I suppose when you look at the people who are in capturing reality, the reality is that most of them are pretty high profile. So, yes, of course, most of them knew each other. The Americans certainly knew about a lot of the Europeans and vice versa. I guess, you could argue that perhaps some of the people I interviewed in France, for example, were not that well known to other people just by virtue of language, that kind of issue. But, people like Patricio Guzman, he's extremely known by everybody because of the power of his work and what it's done to convey the story of Chile to the rest of the world. I think in most cases, people did know each other, probably without exception, really.
And when you were thinking of the sort of topics in documentary you'd want to cover with these documentarians, of course there are certain issues that I suppose anybody would want to ask about, would be interested in, such as the borders between truth and falsity, and where these documentarians see them as falling, or if they see them as existing at all. But what other documentary related subjects did you know going in you wanted to get an idea of from these people? Or how many subjects, I should put it this way, only emerged in the actual course of the conversations?
I guess the way to answer that would be really to explain a little bit about how I structured the whole process, because it was obvious from the beginning that it would be just madness to go into each interview thinking, oh yeah, I really want to ask Herzog about that film, and then just let things go off on a tangential sort of way. In the edit suite, you can imagine it would have been just chaos, right? Mm-hmm. So, in fact, what I did was from the very beginning, I started with a structure, a very basic structure, but I knew it would be a structure that would be very usable if ultimately that was the one that I did use in the edit room. And it allowed me to kind of design questions that were going to fit into that structure. Now, of course, when I went into each interview, I was going to be very specific with each of the filmmakers about their work because I did a huge amount of research on all of the filmmakers' works so that they would really feel, I really knew what they were about. You know what I mean? I didn't want it to be just a superficial sort of, oh, yeah, tell me about, what you do kind of thing. I wanted them to know that I really had looked at their work, I loved their work, and I wanted them to feel that connection. And I think it shows when you look at the interviews. So really, it was sort of that way that we got started, with the interview process. And it followed right through for the interviews, and it followed right through in the edit suite.
I would imagine that one of the goals here, one of the side goals, you might say, was to avoid piling up so much footage that you were going to be overwhelmed with it in the editing room. So how much time did you allow yourself with these documentarians? There had to be a limit because, some of these people, I know Werner Herzog, you could have a conversation the length of the entire film just with him. No problem. The length of the film and the special features with all him talking. So what was the limit for the time you wanted to spend with every filmmaker so that you could manageably cut this together?
I suppose the thing that really determined that factor a lot was how much time, I could impose myself on each of them, because that was sort of one of the logistical problems of even getting through the interview phase was who was available when. When you think about documentarians, they're usually so busy, either, in development, doing research, flying around the world, in the madness of production, or just locked in their edit suite. So it was quite a challenge to get just little blocks of time with each of them. And I didn't want to abuse it. I didn't want to, sort of exhaust my interview subject. So I kind of would approach them with the ask would be, well, could you give an hour and a half kind of? But of course that hour and a half got stretched a few times. Ultimately, I suppose, a lot of the interviews did go to 2 hours. And if the big challenge there, of course, was to get the questions in that I really, really wanted to ask. Unfortunately, what that meant was that I really couldn't just sort of follow some of the thoughts that would come up, as much as it would have been interesting. But I suppose in the end, that served me well, because it meant that I didn't have all of this extraneous material that was really, really fascinating in and of itself, but wasn't going to be able to fit into the film.
Now, what about these conversations you were conducting changed as you went along? Because you say you did have one structure as you went in, but how did the way, maybe the structure was the same for every conversation, but what maybe just little things changed about the way you did these interviews as you did more and more of them and essentially had a feedback loop going where you'd get the response from doing them? Did you alter the way you interviewed at all?
I did have to really be very in the moment and paying attention to how the person would be responding to the questions, and sometimes their answer would sort of lead me in a direction that I hadn't really thought I was going to take originally, but it was just a very organic lead into another question that I had wanted to ask. So I think that as I went along, what I really tried to tap into was to make it a conversation rather than looking down at a piece of paper and asking people questions that were on the paper kind of thing. But it was challenging, to be able to get that sort of cross between having the feel of being improvised and conversational, but at the same time really addressing what I knew that I needed when I got into the edit room, you know?
Yes, I know exactly what that's like. And of course, making an interview conversational, that, if anything, I think is the kind of the number one challenge. Now, you do say that you wanted to avoid the sort of question sheet effect, I call it, where it sounds like everything has been prepared on the interviewer's side beforehand. Now, I want to ask you, did you identify anything else in documentaries you'd seen before, or what have you, things you wanted to, techniques you wanted to, results you wanted to avoid, perhaps, in your own film?
I think when I looked at, let's say, just the anthology kind of works that were out there, not to, really sound negative about them, but I knew that what I was really concerned about was this sort of chaotic feeling that you can start getting when you're looking at something that involves many different speakers and the works of many different interview subjects. So this was actually what was behind the way I designed the look of the interviews. I felt that because I knew that I was going to cut in umpteen zillion, minutes of footage from, I think we ended up with 60 different documentaries in there. I knew that I didn't want to add to that sort of visual chaos, that it was very important to me that I was going to give kind of a nice, calm space in between the footage, so that the footage was going to really sort of speak on its own and be very clearly footage about, what this person was talking about. So I think visual chaos was a big issue for me. I really wanted to avoid that.
I do very much admire the fact that, yes, there is no visual chaos in capturing reality, and it does have it. It's something where I really noticed first was it's not necessarily a spare style, but it is maybe a simple one where the interviews, yes, they'll have the black background, and then it's essentially interviews, titles, and footage from these documentarians' documentaries. Now, did maintaining this simple style end up being a help for you? Did it make it a little easier to cut together, or was it actually more of a challenge to maintain that?
I think it would be good to also mention about that particular approach I took with the interviews, that it was also about showing these people for who, having those moments with them to allow for more of an intimate kind of moment with each of the documentary directors. Because the thing about documentary is that we slave away behind the scenes, and we're very rarely actually seen by a general public. And I just think that people who make documentaries, being, a documentary director myself, I know what we go through. And it's incredibly demanding at the kind of work that we decide to do. And there's sort of this, vow of poverty and this whole kind of devotion to getting out in the world and bringing the stories to humanity so that humanity can perhaps better see itself, that kind of altruistic, if you will, feeling. So I wanted people to be able to see who is behind the scenes making these works, So this was another reason that I went for that very sparse interviewing style. But of course, it's deceivingly sparse, In fact, if you were able to, you sort of see a bit in the beginning of what the setups were for the lighting.
Yes.
and they were kind of pretty exotic, just to achieve that very simple look. But it was something that, in fact, even Errol Morris commented on as, I think I left that little snippet in the end. He says, I like your lighting, By and large, I can't say that going that way with the interviews was a hindrance. I felt like it was a connective tissue in a way, really.
I want to go back to this idea of the vow of poverty you mentioned, that the documentarians somewhat, not formally, but takes in effect, because this is something that comes up a bit in capturing reality itself, that there's not a lot of money to be made in documentary. And that is interesting to me because it seems like even though it may be the case, I can't identify in your reason to myself that it need be the case. Why is this condition of there not being any money to make a documentary obtained quite so long?
I think it relates very directly to the idea of marketing. And the reality is that the marketing dollars just aren't there the way they are for fiction for various reasons. You could go into, a whole analysis about the business. But I think that is one of the major differences is that for, a big Hollywood fiction film, their budget for marketing the film is huge compared to, let's say, just the budget for, a sort of high-end documentary. So, I think that is one of the main factors, and I think also perhaps we could talk about, because it ties into that too, is because they're not being kind of pushed out there. They're not getting the marketing dollars. They're not getting the publicity. People don't know very much about documentary. So this was one thing that I was really hoping Capturing Reality would address. And it's a lot of the reason why it is the way it is as a film, is to make people feel like, this is actually really interesting. And I don't feel like I'm being taught something, which I think is sort of a leftover of the early days of documentary, that documentary originally was sort of this medicine that you took, to cure the ills of the world or whatever.
Yes,
but
it's certainly an idea to get away from, yes.
Yeah, like nowadays documentary is just so wide open. It can be anything. It's amazing what it can be.
And I believe this was an Errol Morris point as well, where he says, is it his quote that there's no such thing as a closely defined documentary boundary? It's essentially been whatever people have wanted it to be over the years, correct?
Yeah, Errol does say that. He says, the thing I don't like about it is that you're constantly being told that documentary is one thing, and it's not. It's a whole cornucopia of possibilities.
It does seem like, though, years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when someone said documentary, or when I said documentary, somebody would think, oh, you mean like a nature documentary, like I'm going to watch dolphins swim around for a while. That seems to have gone away. People now know documentaries can be other things. Have you found that generally as well?
Well, who we have a huge debt to pay to is Michael Moore for that, because it's really Michael Moore who made that big breakthrough that, with Roger and me, people realized, hey, documentary can actually be pretty engaging and pretty compelling and very dramatic and, and exciting. So, yeah, I think it's a lot thanks to Michael Moore, actually.
And Michael Moore raises an interesting issue here, because his films do make money. His films do quite well financially, and they are typically classified as documentaries. When you go to the video store, there they are in documentary. But there does seem to be a distinct difference between his works and those of the documentarians you have in Capturing Reality. And here I specifically mean Michael Moore, tends to make arguments with his documentaries, and I think for a lot of these filmmakers, at least my favorites among them that you talk to, they don't tend to make arguments. They tend more to observe. Now, do you think that has anything to do with the fact that Michael Moore's movies get marketed more and they make more money, is that they are more argumentative? Because that's really the main difference I see between what he does and what a documentarian who says they don't make any money does.
Well, I think that Michael Moore himself has a lot to do with the popularity of his particular stylistic approach. He's in the film, and he's sort of hosting you. He has this hypothesis that he's putting forward in each of his documentaries, and his style is very much about him. So nobody else is Michael Moore. There is that factor, and it is one type of, a whole range of types of documentary. There's no other Michael Moore in the world. There's Michael Moore. And so in a way, it does make it kind of, that way that, well, actually, who else you could compare to Michael Moore was Nick Broomfield.
Oh, yes, I was going to mention him in this context as well.
Yeah. He was right in there, right on screen, and sort of provoking things at the right moments, kind of, So there is that style, that stylistic approach that some people gravitate towards. But yeah, I did try to get Michael Moore, actually.
He seems like he would be a very busy guy.
Exactly.
I assume so. But and the style, yes, of course. Michael Moore, he's on screen there. He's talking, he's provoking, he's making arguments. Nick Broomfield as well. He's on screen. I mean, he's in a way he's become iconic to people who haven't even seen his movies because he's been in those Volkswagen commercials or whatever, where he was holding the boom mic up just like in his movies.
True, yeah.
And he also makes some arguments. I mean, one need only watch a movie like Kurt and Courtney to see that in action. But what I want to get at as well is, I suppose it seems to me the operative divide here is, and maybe you consider this important and maybe you don't, and let me know how much you do, but between the documentarians who do have a specific argument to make with their movies and the ones who are more literally documenting. Now, is this a bogus divide to your mind, or is it actually, am I seeing a real bifurcation?
I think there's quite an overlap. I think it's more about the approach, that there are filmmakers who are really making a point, but they're making it in a less sort of in-your-face kind of way. So I don't think you could break it down that way. I think, if you look at works like, I don't know, Molly Dineen, who's in Capturing Reality, and she does works that really are about an issue, but she's not going to be as provocative, shall we say, as a Michael Moore or a Nick Broomfield.
And I have to get this out on the airwaves. For some reason, Molly Dineen's films are not available in the U.S. I don't know why. Is the situation different in Canada?
I don't know what that is. It's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd seen some of them before, and I went to go get them off of Netflix as we have here. And I don't know if Zip in Canada has them, but I looked and there was absolutely nothing, and I feel like I have to start a petition or something. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's a great idea because, yeah, she's such a talented filmmaker. And the works that she's done are just so amazing. I was really blown away by Heart of the Angel, which, there's an excerpt in Capturing Reality of that. But she's done a number of films. The Ark is amazing. I don't know if you've seen that, but that's a whole series she did on the London Zoo. And that's just incredible.
What is the situation with her films? Are they released elsewhere in the world? Am I just unlucky in the States here?
Yeah, I don't know. Good question, 'cause we don't have them here either in Canada.
Oh, really?
No.
Now, this is all a counterexample, of course, to one thing I wanted to ask about, which is that we seem to be in an era where documentaries are more available than ever, with watching on demand, with watching online in various ways, with Netflix, with Zip, with all these services, with DVDs being very cheap to produce. Have you seen, I guess I'll put it this way, what have you seen as the effects of this much wider availability of documentaries, the ease with which we can now get them?
Now, by effects, what do you mean?
Well, it just, in terms of, let's say, one effect I would imagine would be that perhaps more people are getting into making documentaries because of it. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it is. Another effect is that perhaps the vow of poverty might be a little bit attenuated because there are more outlets. You don't need to release to 100 theaters in the country. You could potentially release on instant viewing on Netflix or on DVD only, and maybe stand a chance of making a little bit of money. These are things I might expect. Have you seen any of them?
Yeah, well, actually you raise a very interesting point. I think one of the results of documentary becoming more popularized and more readily available in general is that in the last 10 years, most teaching institutions have started up programs that will, train young people to become documentary filmmakers. There's, I think, a number of problems around that, in that, unfortunately, a lot of those programs are teaching about the form of the work, but they're not really teaching about the practicalities of how to get out in the world and make your living at it. Uh-huh. And I come across that quite often because I mentor or teach a lot of young people. And I think it's, it's sort of reaching probably peak right now because It's got to diminish. There's just too many, wide-eyed, aspiring documentary filmmakers out there that are learning very quickly that making documentary is incredibly difficult, and earning a living at it is just, I don't know. I think it's better in the States. That's my feeling. But in Canada, anyway, right now, it's just getting to be kind of, a privilege if you can get to make your living as a documentary filmmaker, So I think that is one effect that we can see coming out of this reality, that there is a lot more documentary just generally available. And in terms of the distribution, this is a big factor when it comes to documentary, because like we were saying earlier about documentary just not having the big bucks behind it to really get it the kind of publicity as a fiction film would, that really affects the distribution a lot. But I think sort of bigger than that is the fact that the whole distribution model is really sort of in chaos right now, and people are trying to figure out, with all this new technology, how we can effectively get our work out there and find ways that it would actually make money. Because, it's one thing to have your documentary out there, for free, or parts of it on YouTube,
Yeah.
But that's not going to earn you a living, right?
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Be sure to check out our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace, or if you prefer, just colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Pepita Ferrari, director of Capturing Reality, the Art of Documentary. And with the documentarians you talk to in Capturing Reality, now some of them they make mainstream films as well that do get the couple hundred theater release, and some of them do make commercials. I know Errol Morris does. Do you see a pattern as far as what they do outside of documentary to earn their living or what have you?
I think that this is more the direction that of what let's say a long-term professional in documentary does, is they turn towards other forms of cinema that will allow them to make documentaries. Because what I see is that people who are really, really committed to documentary because, they've fallen in love with it, and I think, essentially that's what happens, is that eventually you either leave documentary because it's too difficult, or you're so in love with it or addicted. I would actually say it's kind of an addiction, that you have to keep going and you have to keep making documentaries. But the way that a lot of these people end up finding to be able to do that is they turn to exactly what you said. They end up making commercial work. Some of them turn to fiction. Some of them experiment with hybrids, like Nick Broomfield, who we were just talking about. He's now moving into a more hybrid area so that his works are a cross between documentary. He uses a lot of the techniques of documentary, but his films are scripted now, and they're, using actors. So he's trying to find ways that his work will reach a wider public. So I think, there's different ways that long-term documentary filmmakers seek out to, in order to be able to stay in the field. And I think the other distinction, of course, would be that there's making documentary that is meant directly for television, and there's documentary that is being approached as a more kind of artistic or, festival kind of undertaking.
Now, since we've mentioned, a fine film like Nick Broomfield's Ghosts that is part documentary and part, scripted.
Isn't that amazing, that film?
It certainly is, and it's a good example of what you're talking about, where there's a hybridization, a cross-pollination. Now, even outside of Broomfield's work, and he's become quite good at that, how much of this do you see? How much hybridization between documentary and other film techniques have you watched go on?
Well, I think that would be probably the main area of experimentation, would be between that fiction world and that documentary world, and that hybridization that is happening a lot now. You could argue that this is something that's happening all over with all kinds of media. News is trying to be more entertaining rather than just being straightforward news. Reality TV is kind of quasi-documentary, but not quite, because there's this entertainment factor. I mean, entertainment is sort of the key word, really, isn't it, when you're talking about any kind of media these days? So there's a big crossover happening in all forms of media, and it's all, with this idea of entertainment, essentially, I think.
I can see a couple different perspectives on this edition of a little more of what might be called the entertainment, as we've said, or hybridization with other forms. I can see a perspective that says this is a compromise of documentary, and I can see a perspective that says, no, it's an enrichment of documentary. It's an addition of variety. It makes documentary into so many more things that might be more accessible. Do you have any point on the spectrum you personally fall between those views?
Well, I think what I find particularly worrisome and is something to be really closely monitored is who is making these works, because here we're moving into an area that really touches upon ethics, and truth, of course, is this whole other big discussion, but truth relating to documentary. But the ethical component of what is acceptable is a big discussion that I think needs to be had, and it isn't being had. And it really is so dependent on who is behind the camera and who is putting that film together and what their sense of ethics is,
This is a question that does arise, of course, in capturing reality, and that there's a whole gamut of views on truth and fiction and reality and falsity with these filmmakers. And on one hand, you've got, say, a Werner Herzog, who has been messing with the distinction between those two, or sort of, in some cases, disregarding it for his own definition of truth for many years, since the 70s. And then you've got others, I don't know if I can name a specific name here, but who are more into the opposite of that. Try to find what's actually true and limit yourself to that. Now, how wide is this actual spectrum between attitudes about truth and falsity and what belongs in a documentary?
It's such a huge topic area, the idea of truth and whether it's even possible to convey so-called truth. And then you have, as you mentioned, Herzog at the other end of the spectrum who says that I'm not really concerned about facts. That's quite irrelevant to me. What I'm after is another inner truth, or what he calls his ecstatic truth.
Yes.
And I know that sounds like such a sort of philosophical concept, but really, if you look at his work and you understand where he's coming from, his idea of truth is still a very valid concept of truth, but it's Werner Herzog's concept of truth. Now, this is sort of a very good example of what the kind of difficulties that one can have in trying to define truth, just even trying to define truth, because again, in Capturing Reality, Errol Morris talks about it, doesn't he, about there's truth for you, there's truth for me. Ultimately, is there such a thing as an objective truth? And Errol Morris says that there is. And that is, his argument is that is what he sets out to achieve in his films, is to show that if you look at all the different perspectives on a particular moment, you will ultimately find what the objective truth was. Because truth can be so subjective. And, Herzog is sort of the ultimate example of a subjective truth, isn't he? But then there's other filmmakers that I've interviewed, like Scott Hicks, who says, well, come on, let's be honest here. It's all manipulation. So, yeah, it's such an elastic thing, truth, really. Isn't it?
Indeed it is, and Errol Morris, of course, has, in recent months and recent years, he's become, if you read his Twitter feed, very, very fixated on the concept about the relationship of images and capturing with photography the world to the truth of that world. It's all quite interesting, but I do wonder, because in my experience interviewing people, that there's this phenomenon with some that Some people, even if they work with these very big concepts, shall we call them, they're not always super forthcoming talking about them. Or more specifically, if you ask them the why, if you ask them about the why of what they do, that's not always something people are prepared to answer. Now, it sounds like all of the filmmakers in Capturing Reality, they were ready and willing to talk about the why. Was that actually the case?
Unfortunately, I didn't have time in the film to get into those sort of deeper personal kinds of questions, because I find that a very fascinating area, and the film was more about the works in a way. So I was sort of unable to really explore that area. I think what's interesting is that in my situation, talking to these 40 documentary directors, it's the kind of discussion that most of them don't ever get to have, because most of them are always so busy making their work. We're so caught up in doing what we're doing, and it served my purposes actually wonderfully well, because it was actually sort of like a pleasure for them to have somebody who also was a documentary filmmaker ask them about what they're doing,
Right. Yeah. Yes. It's sort of an effect of perhaps they can finally open the floodgates for things they've been wanting to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And have all those conversations that they would love to have about what it is that they're doing. But nobody ever sort of bothers. Like, this is a wonderful luxury for me to have somebody like you interviewing me and asking me all these very sort of deep questions about what I do. It's it's a lovely opportunity.
Now, when you're talking to these documentarians, getting the floodgates open, they're finally talking about their craft. Did anything they said surprise you? Did you have any big unexpected points or any unexpected ideas come from these people? Or was it, it was all interesting, but was it all what you expected to hear?
It was full of surprises in some ways, the whole process, because honestly, there were a number of filmmakers whose works I wasn't very familiar with when I started out, and so I just had a very kind of preconceived notion about who they were and what they did. But then I would watch their films, and time after time I would come out of my screenings and go, "Wow, this person is a really interesting filmmaker because of blah blah blah." I would always come away from my screenings thinking, gee, it's really impressive, the kind of work they're doing. And then I'd go into the interviews, with all my very carefully thought out questions. And I was just blown away by the thought that went into the answers. That was really, really impressive. So I would come out of every interview thinking, oh my God, like another great interview, what am I going to do, So it was sort of, the surprise was always in the richness of what I was coming out with from the whole experience. It kind of made my chore at the end extremely difficult, of course, because I had such rich material from all of these amazing filmmakers. And of course, I had gone into the process very conscious of the necessity of having an open mind, and keeping that kind of attitude, because I really felt that I could not go into a film like that with any kind of really hard and fast, personal, let's say, criteria about anyone's work. I really had to let each of those filmmakers speak for themselves. That was the whole challenge, really, in itself.
When you go into the editing room, then, with these so many hours of pure conversation, you're getting a lot of rich material from it. How do you even start with the process of sculpting this into a film one can watch in just a couple hours?
It was the worst the worst edit I've ever had in terms of. Yeah, it was kind of like cutting my way through jungle undergrowth, and it really felt that way. And in most edits, you kind of know that there's a give and take. There's days where you want to just let your editor work, and you don't have to be there, and you can go away and either work on your paper edit or do something else. But And I kept thinking, every week I kept thinking, oh, next week it's going to be easier, and I'll be able to not be there, and I can let, Barbara Brown was my amazing editor who accompanied me on the journey, let Barbara just work away, but it never happened. It was like a constant struggle to figure out a balance. That was the key, was the balance and flow, and you knew right away when you were going off on a tangent, that you just could not afford to indulge in. But I guess key to the whole thing was the fact that I was really determined from the outset to make a film, and that it would be very watchable, and it would have a dramatic arc in it, built into it, So that really kind of, I think, raised the bar in terms of the challenge that I was facing in the edit room. And the other thing that, of course, you always have these kind of revelations when you come out of, your shoots and you think you've gotten all this amazing material. But then when you're in the edit suite, you understand that there are two things. There's the moment that you live when you're shooting, and that reality, and then there's the moment where you actually see what you got on film. And so sometimes I would come out of an interview just like really blown away, but when I looked at it, it was like, oh, okay, it wasn't quite as amazing as I thought, like I was having an incredible experience with that person, but, some material just, I couldn't use as much as I thought I was going to be able to.
Then let me ask you this. I find this to be the case with the interviews I conduct often, is that I will think certain things are great when I'm recording, and then other material will sort of slip under my radar, and I won't know that some stuff is great that I didn't think was great while recording until I listen again. Does it work the same for you, where things pop up that kind of escaped your attention the first time, but you think to yourself, oh, actually, that's a very solid point that I'm going to have to include?
Well, yeah, you're right, because, you can imagine I had 60 hours of jam-packed interview material, and there was very little dead air or, frivolous kind of conversation in there. It was all very intense exchanges. So it was really, it was really difficult to have a really full assessment right away of everything. And I did feel that my first, pass through of the material was like only kind of scratching the surface. But of course, the thing was that the benefit of having such a difficult edit was that I had to go over and over and over and over all those 40 interviews. And I really got to know the material, and I really got to, hear the nuance, because, words on paper are one thing, but the way a person says something is another thing. So that would come into play as well,
This is something that a lot of people I don't think will understand right away, and certainly it's something I didn't understand until I started working with visual media, is that you do form very much of it's like in the special features Herzog says he memorizes all his footage. How close a relationship was this to your footage? I mean, did you know if you wanted to find somebody talking about a certain subject, you could kind of go right to it just based on your memory of where it was? Or
as time went by, I would start having, kind of pretty good recollections of specific interviews and, things that really kind of just stuck in my head. I guess it would be more a sound thing, actually, rather than just something on paper, because I had lived every moment of those interviews. So, except, of course, I don't speak Portuguese and Spanish, for full disclosure here. So my amazing producer, Michelle van Bussicum, is multilingual, and she was able to do those interviews. But Michelle had been very, very closely involved in the project. It was an amazing collaboration, actually. And we would go through the questions together. So, even though that wasn't me in those particular interviews, she was really speaking very directly, for me in the connection with those particular filmmakers.
Now, because Capturing Reality is, of course, a documentary about documentary. There's a lot of very interesting meta issues we can get into, although probably not in the last 10 minutes of the show. But I will ask, how many echoes did you observe of you're making this documentary while you're talking so much about documentary, learning so much more about documentary? Did you have a lot of moments where you were just putting this thing together at any stage and you thought, oh, this is just like what Jessica Yu said, or this is just like what Scott Hicks said, or what Errol Morris said about their process? Did you find a lot of resonances there between what these documentarians would talk about and what you were actually living?
Yeah, I was very aware of my going through the process of capturing reality and kind of thinking back on each of those interviews and the different sensibilities that each of those filmmakers represented. To me, it was really key that I was going to be very respectful of everyone, and it meant that I made decisions about how that film was put together that would allow room for that. I think that would be the best way to put it, I guess, let's say an example would be, an obvious one would be, there were certain documentary filmmakers that really honestly feel that music in documentary is sort of really a no-no. And, why would you want to put music in a documentary? It's about reality, and music is projecting your artistic vision on it. So I was very careful, for example, about how much music I did use or where it was put. Those kind of issues. I thought about what I had gleaned from the interviews very much in the process of making the film, and of course afterwards. I mean, I'm still a year later, just really digesting everything that I went through, It was such a rich experience. I mean, it's incredible. What a gift. And luckily I could make the second DVD, the extras,
Oh, yes, that's very nice to see the additional material there. And,
oh, yeah.
And one of the, I believe this was only additional material, it might have made it into the film itself, though, is where the documentarians talk about the essentiality of risk to what they do. I mean, did you find that there were noticeable risks in your own endeavor in the making of this movie? What kind of risks were you taking?
I suppose the main risk would be whether I really connected.
Oh, yes.
That would be the main risk. Now, fortunately, I think I'm a pretty open person, so my presence was always very much about wanting to get to know each of these people and finding out very quickly what it was that they, were going to kind of connect with, I suppose, in who I was or how I could make them feel comfortable. I suppose that would be it, really, isn't it? It's in any interview, it's really about making that person feel comfortable. But I kind of went in there with that attitude of, I really want to know who you are and what you do, and I love your work, kind of, and being aware of each of their sensibilities about their work, like a Herzog, for Herzog, you have to really respect who he is, because he is contentious. Some people just don't understand Herzog at all. Whereas, I'm a huge admirer just because I understand, what he's trying to put out there, and he takes huge risks in his work.
And certainly his products are controversial, but he seems like an awfully nice fellow.
That was a real surprise. Yeah. I was, as you can imagine, I was very nervous about going into certain interviews. That would be one, and the other was Errol, actually.
Yes, and he also seems like a guy who's, and maybe he doesn't seem quite as open in viewing him as Herzog does, but he seems like someone who's always ready to talk about what you want to ask him.
Well, what I loved about interviewing Errol was that he is very thoughtful. So everything that came out of his mouth pretty much was like, wow, that's so well put. And he would really, really make an obvious effort to get to the crux of the question. He wasn't just going to toss off an answer. And I really loved that kind of intensity that he brought to the process. And then, Herzog was really interesting in that you do expect him to have this very severe kind of manner, because of the kind of work he does that has that edge. But then here he is, he's this, very sweet and generous kind of person. Yeah, those were the two I was sort of most nervous about, but I don't think, for the rest I felt a nervousness. I was just really eager to meet them.
Certainly, I don't know whether this helps or not, but does it help to come off as a fan of their work, or is it better to play that cool?
I think what was key was really making it clear that I really understood their work, not necessarily that I was a fan, because that would be, that would be a little too easy. And especially for a documentarian who's always, kind of looking below the surface, right? So I wasn't going to get away with any kind of easy fluff, I think your work's amazing, the one time I think where I kind of blew it was with Werner Herzog when he was leaving, and I was just so kind of relieved that the interview had gone well. As he was going down the hallway, I sort of yelled after him, "Now I'm going to watch all 60 of your films." That was the one time where I kind of went a little overboard.
And did you watch them all again after that?
All 60? Are you kidding? I don't think I could even get all 60, but I certainly immediately, asked for Christmas for a DVD set of a whole bunch.
Fair enough. The title of the film, once again, is Capturing Reality, The Art of Documentary. Pepita Ferrari, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Well, thank you, Colin. It's really been fun talking.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. As always, you can find our complete interview archive, if you're so inclined, at colinmarshallradio.com or on iTunes. Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. You can visit him at benalthouse.com. And if you have any feedback, positive, negative, or anywhere in between or outside of that spectrum, send it along to Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.